Whether it comes to budget processes or peacekeeping operations oversight or transparency, the United Nations has been unacceptably slow to reform. Waste, fraud, abuse, and general mismanagement are widespread at the UN. Yet the position of U.S. representatives to the United Nations for management and reform has been vacant for over 2 years. That makes it appear that the United Nations oversight has simply not been a priority to the administration, which I hope you can change. This is unfortunate. The United States is by far the largest contributor to the United Nations, donating more than $6 billion in 2009 alone. I believe American taxpayers deserve more accountability for their dollars. One major area of concern is the mandated items Americans are forced to pay for our non-voluntary UN contributions. Because of this, Americans end up paying for programs that do not align with our national security and foreign policy objectives. For example, since 2006, nearly half of the country-specific resolutions passed by the United Nations Human Rights Council, which Americans are required to fund, have focused on condemning Israel. Meanwhile, notorious human rights offenders like Iran and Cuba have been ignored. In the past, the United States has pressured the UN to review their mandates. This process has stalled largely because UN member states are focused on protecting the funding for their pet programs. Over 9,000 of these programs currently exist. Programs that duplicate each other and outdated mandates must be streamlined, eliminated, and merged. The U.S. also sends the United Nations voluntary contributions. President Obama's Bipartisan Debt Commission proposed making a reduction in the amount of voluntary contributions the U.S. gives the UN on its draft of spending cut proposals. And we should go much further. The United Kingdom, as you're aware, has recommended cutting funding for 4 agencies and put others on notice for urgent improvement, or they would face cuts as well. The United States should examine these cuts and take similar actions. Finally, UN peacekeeping missions must have more accountability, much more. According to a 2007 report by the United Nations Office on Internal Oversight Services, of roughly $1.4 billion in peacekeeping contracts examined, significant corruption schemes were involved in roughly 44% of these contracts, totaling about $619 million. Even though the United Nations supposedly has a zero-tolerance policy when it comes to abuses against women and children, peacekeeping missions have been plagued with allegations of misconduct by UN peacekeepers. I mean, this is deeply disturbing, and I know this has been none of your doing at this point, but I think the record is important, and I'd like to start by reading you a few figures about these allegations and how much money American taxpayers have spent on those very missions. In 2010, 83 allegations of misconduct against the UN peacekeepers and civilian personnel were reported. The U.S. contribution to UN peacekeeping activities was roughly $2.13 billion that year. In 2009, there were 40 reported allegations of sexual abuse by UN peacekeepers in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The U.S. assessed contribution for that year in the DRC was roughly $210 million. In 2007, UN peacekeepers were accused of serious allegations of widespread sexual exploitation and abuse in the Ivory Coast. U.S. contributions to that mission in 2007 were roughly $138 million. A 2007 source reported that 20 allegations of UN peacekeeping sexual misconduct with children in southern Sudan. U.S. taxpayer-funded contributions for that mission in 2007 was roughly $215 million. Just a couple of more of these, but in November of 2007, peacekeepers were removed from Haiti following allegations of sexual exploitation and abuse of children. U.S. contributions to this peacekeeping mission were around $96 million. In 2005, UN peacekeepers were reported to have traded in gold and sold weapons to militia groups. U.S. taxpayers in 2005 gave over $293 million to the peacekeeping mission in the DRC. That brings me to my question. Are you willing to cut funding for these missions where women and children have been abused? If not, why should American taxpayers continue to pay for missions where women and children have been hurt? And we realize that, again, the special interests that are involved here are going to be very determined to keep the funding without the oversight that you talk about. The culture in the UN is going to be very difficult to change. But as you look at these figures, as you hear them, and I'm sure you're aware of a lot of them, how do you intend to address it, and what are you going to do as far as funding versus mission if we know there's a problem of this kind?
Well, thank you, Senator. I want to wholeheartedly agree that any incidents of sexual exploitation by any peacekeeper is something that ought to trouble us greatly and is unacceptable, even against the context of 120,000 deployed in 14 different missions. Those numbers of incidents are deeply troubling and offensive and unacceptable. There has been peacekeeping is something that cuts across many of the portfolios of the senior team at the mission, from the permanent representative to others, and I would look forward to working with my colleagues to continue to make strides on this problem. There have been some recent reforms put in place. There are now conduct and discipline teams deployed who weren't before, but there is clearly much to do to support the zero tolerance policy that the United States government has gotten behind. That there should be no more such reports as we go forward, and we need to work with the whole UN system and other member states to make sure that that is the case.
Can you help explain, and again, I know you're looking at this relatively new, but what could be the explanation after more than 5 years of these reports? And some of them have been publicized in the international media. Why so little has been done at the UN to address this? You would think they understand the importance of the credibility in the international community, but there has been resistance even to deal with this.
Well, yeah, as you suggest, Senator, it's difficult for me to talk about what precedes what I hope will be my tenure.
Right.
But I think the one of the broader contexts that you alluded to is that this has been an area of tremendous growth in a very short period of time, that the size and scope and complexity of peacekeeping operations over approximately the last decade has almost, I think, essentially quadrupled. Not just in size, but in what used to be very conventional kinds of truly peacekeeping missions have become much more complicated in some much more difficult circumstances. So that obviously makes it makes everything that has to do with peacekeeping more challenging. And I think that the architecture of managing this has lagged behind what we've expected them to do. Now, I think what we need to do is make sure that that's no longer the case. Not just to be a moral voice, but to understand this comes down to who are the leaders of each mission, which is something we need to devote attention to, and how are they pursuing these.
Just a quick question before I run out of time. Will you be willing to hold the budget hostage, in effect, our payments, our contributions to various aspects of the United Nations in order to get the attention of these people here? Are you willing to come back to us and suggest we withhold funding until we get certain reforms? Because I think that's the only leverage we're ultimately going to have.
Well, Senator, I am willing to get the attention and make the progress, and I'm willing to and hope to work with you to do that. The United States government position on withholding has been that our best chance of getting reforms comes from advocating from the position of strength that, thanks to all of you, we now have, that no one can say the U.S. has not done its share and is not paying its assessed dues. I understand that there are good people with different points of view around this issue, and what I want to take away from that debate is a universal commitment to changing the results that we see and leveraging the resources we have to get those results.
But right now, the acting director of the UN's investigation division, Michael Dudley, is under investigation. The UN's Internal Oversight Office is suffering from a lack of credibility. Secretary General ignores its recommendations, and the former head of the office wrote a scathing end-of-mission report which described the Secretary General as unaccountable and unworthy of the position. If confirmed, will you use the voice and vote of the United States to ensure that a reputable, independent, and qualified chief investigator is appointed?
Yes. Senator, I think that goes to the core of giving every interested party an assurance that things really are different and there will be a new day. I think, as you know from your experience in government, the existence of oversight institutions which cannot be tampered with and who don't have their budgets and their authority changed is crucial, absolutely crucial. I think that is among the first items on my list. And having someone in that position as well, by the way, Senators, having the staff slots on the financial crimes unit of that office, which we were instrumental in demanding be formed, having those positions filled is virtually my highest priority.